Relations among European colonists and Indian peoples were never simple. Their lives intersected in many ways, both peaceful and violent, and between these very different cultures was often a deep experience of both attraction and repulsion.
I think it sometimes is hard for us to appreciate the sheer element of shock and strangeness that simply must have confronted these people when they first stepped out of their boats and onto the shores of this unfamiliar land. One of the first shocks was simply confronting this, as they saw it, this deep and almost impenetrable wilderness. And wilderness is a word that is just full of their own sense of wonderment and strangeness and fear. The other major element of the encounter experience was, of course, the encounter with very unfamiliar, very different kinds of people, the people who populated this wilderness, the Native American people, or the Indians, as they came to call them. The Indian people of northeastern North America in that time period had a long-standing tradition around the taking of captives in warfare. So one of the things that inevitably happened in the at least occasional outbreaks of full-fledged warfare with Indians was that some colonists were taken captive. And this was distressing not just on the obvious personal level, losing a family member, a friend, a member of one's own community, a neighbor, and so forth and so on, but also because it seemed to symbolize and epitomize the larger danger that the whole colonizing project faced. They were coming to civilize, to tame the wilderness and civilize the savage people they found here. And yet there was always this worry that maybe the effects, the changes, would reverse themselves and go in the opposite direction. It got worse when it turned out that some of the people who were taken away as captives never came back, and some indeed chose never to come back. Now, a colonist who was captured and then chose to stay among the savages and become savage seemed to me to epitomize a kind of fundamental issue that runs all through colonial history, really from the beginning to the end. Are we civilizing them and changing them, or are they changing us in the long run?
One man who witnessed the profound changes brought about by the English-Indian encounter was Metacomet, who became leader of the Wampanoags in the 1660s. He remembered when his father, Massasoit, had first come to the aid of the Pilgrims at Plymouth.
The English who first came to this country were but a handful of people, forlorn, poor, and distressed. My father was then sachem. He relieved their distress in the most kind and hospitable manner. He gave them land to plant and build upon. They flourished and increased.
The impression is often given in our history books that the Pilgrims arrive and then almost immediately there's conflict and warfare with Indian peoples. But there are long periods during the 17th century where Indian people are coexisting and cooperating with English people, and where their presence is actually assisting the development of English settlement. They're often trading, and there are the beginnings of what one might almost describe as kind of lively interethnic communities. The New England that's developing in the 17th century, a New England of almost shared lives to some degree between Indians and English, is in many ways extremely vulnerable, because on the one hand, ingrained in many of the English reactions to Indians is that these people are actually less than human beings. They are not English, they are not civilized. They are very often regarded as savages, people whose right to the land is somewhat tenuous, because the English, as Christian, civilized people, have a claim to the land to build a new society on the land.
As the English population increased, demanding ever more land, Indian peoples were squeezed tighter and tighter.
By various means, they got possessed of a great part of his territory. but he still remained their friend until he died. Soon after I became sachem, they disarmed all my people. Our land was taken. I am determined not to live until I have no country.
In the 1670s, Metacomet, whom the English know as King Philip, heads a war of Indian resistance, we might even call it a war of Indian independence, against the English. That's a war that the Indians very nearly win. It's a war that costs New England, Puritan New England, very heavily, until they finally manage to defeat King Philip's forces, and the Indian peoples of central and southern New England are defeated, dispersed, and English power is reaffirmed in that area.
King Philip lost the war and his life. After his death, the citizens of Plymouth Colony cut off his head and stuck it on a pike.